Hey, I'm Lexi, and this is what you should know. ASMR edition. Kidding. I don't have the patience to do ASMR. Although I do find it way easier to focus on studying if I have that on in the background. Can't explain why, but there we have it. But it is spooky season Australia style. The sun is shining, it's finally warming up, and daylight savings has kicked in. The shops are a confusing mix of Halloween and Christmas decorations, and all the streaming suggestions are horror movies. But that could just be mine because I tend to watch them religiously. What can I say? After a stressful episode research, I find relaxing to unwind with a slasher where camping teenagers get outpaced by someone walking slowly. In honor of spooky season, I will be doing more than just the usual. This month will include a gruesome murder, a haunting, and some Australian horror movies. So, with that spooky cheer, this is what you should know about the Woolongong Butcher and Australia's allegedly most evil woman alive. During the 1980s, the world was in the icy grip of the Satanic Panic, which even reached this corner of the world that we call Australia. The belief in ridiculous rumours of bloodthirsty teens sacrificing animals and drinking blood circulated, causing great distress and fear. Thankfully, this began to wane by the 90s, but not completely forgotten. June 12th of 1998 stoked the fear over again with a grisly murder that shook the Illawarra community to its core. David O'Hearn was loved by the community and was described as a kind and compassionate man. He owned a corner store that would be open daily, bright and early, and would open a tab for those in the community that would occasionally find themselves short on money for their purchase. This is why friends and family became concerned that he hadn't opened his store that day and called the police to conduct a welfare check. The scene that greeted officers still haunts them to this day, and this is where I will give a trigger warning, as I am going to describe what they saw. So if this is not your bag, maybe skip forward a bit. David's decapitated head was in the kitchen sink, positioned so that it was facing the front door when entering his home. And it was positioned that way on purpose, as a form of theatrical shock value. One eyeball was missing, having been corkscrewed out. His pants had been pulled down around his ankles, his penis horrifically mutilated, and his entrails strewn on the floor surrounding him. Having been pulled from his body, and 2 lengths of intestine covered other parts of the home, one stretched along the kitchen bench, and the other placed onto a silver serving tray. And as a further insult to his body, the handle of a hammer had been forcibly inserted into his rectum. As if this wasn't shocking enough for the small town of Wollongong, almost as if solely to feed the satanic panic, it was found that David's hand had been cut off and was found casually tossed onto the couch after being used to paint pentagrams and inverted crosses on the living room walls. The word Satan was scrawled across a mirror. One officer remarked, 18 years after the brutal murder, you got the feeling he must have been sitting there, just looking at what he had done. It was not like a frenzy. He has done specific things that would have taken time. It was later discovered after examination that David's head had been smashed in with a wine decanter as the first action in this attack. Shaken to the core by this horrific crime, the community of Wollongong buzzed with questions. What could have motivated such a cruel and violent death? Did David know his killer? And would this be just a once-off attack? Sadly, it would not be. As the police investigated and coming to no promising leads, another attack would occur. On June the 26th of 1998, the former Lord Mayor, Frank Harkel's unsuspecting cleaner, entered his home to a horrific scene that was terrifyingly similar to David O'Hearn's, which for those of you playing at home was just 2 weeks earlier. Frank's head had been beaten in with a bedside lamp. the electrical cord wrapped tightly around his neck. A wooden stake had been lodged into his neck, and tie pins were driven deep into his eyes and cheeks. Another grisly murder, which people presumed was committed in rage. It was after this murder that police revealed that Frank had been arrested for child abuse material and pedophilia, but had been acquitted just 6 months earlier. It was through that the family of 59-year-old bachelor David O'Hearn had admitted their suspicion that he was gay, and with that, police believed they had found their motive. The sad stretch of belief that some people used to have that all gay men were likely to be child abusers. Thankfully, this belief is nowhere near as strong as it used to be, and hopefully with time will die out for good. However, police didn't have to dwell long on this motive, as shortly after, 19-year-old Mark Valera turned himself into the Wollongong police station, calmly declaring that he had been the one to commit both murders. During his confession, Mark claimed that he had been sexually abused as a child by his father, Jack Van Crevel, and upon being propositioned first by David O'Hearn, then by Frank Arkell, had a violent flashback which allegedly caused him to commit these murders, and would then claim he only wanted to protect children from suffering from what he had endured. That being said, the details Mark provided during his confession told a very different story. On the night he brutally murdered David, Mark claimed he knocked on the door claiming to look for a room for rent. Fearing the young man may be homeless, he invited him inside. The two sat on the couch, drinking orange juice and discussing local hostels that may provide him with shelter. It was when David turned his back to rinse the glasses in his sink that he was attacked. When asked how many times he had struck him in the head, Mark replied, "I counted 7, 8, 9, until he was dead." He would later tell police that he had no idea who David was, but that he had seen him before alone in his garden, and was quoted as saying, "I had it in my mind that I just wanted to kill someone that day." Sadly, Frank was lured into a similar trap by the deranged teen. On the morning of his murder, Frank received a phone call from a crying youth that claimed his name was John, and that he was a gay teen with nowhere to turn, and needed to talk to him. Frank agreed to meet him at his home that night. We cannot say for certain what Frank's intentions would have been. Whether they were pure or lewd is something we will never be certain of. But that evening, Mark knocked at his door, and the moment Frank opened it, Mark pushed him into the house and began beating and kicking him around the face and chest. He grabbed a heavy ashtray and began to viciously beat Frank around the face with it. Allegedly, Frank managed to struggle to his knees and was quoted as saying, "I thought we were friends. Why are you doing this to me?" To which Mark responded, "I fucking hate you, and I'm going to kill you." Frank managed to crawl through the house, trailing blood as he was relentlessly pursued by his attacker. Mark realized the ashtray was not enough and grabbed a heavy lamp from the desk, which he then utilized the cord to strangle Frank until he was unconscious, before beating him with the lamp. In a rage, he found a wooden stake and drove it into Frank's neck. The stake snapped, which angered Mark further. He claims this is what drove him to push the tie pins into the victim's eyes. After being taken into custody, police went to search his room, where they found a copy of A to Z Encyclopedia of Serial Killers on his bedside table. Now, let's be honest. That alone is not strange. I'm sure many of us have books, search histories, and podcasts regarding to morbid topics such as murder. However, it was what was in the book that disturbed them. Throughout was Mark's writing, and it appeared that he had been using it as a diary. The following is an excerpt from that diary. "My third victim, if I do happen to get a third victim, it will probably be male. I couldn't bring myself to kill a lady. If I was to grab a third victim, I don't know what I could do with them. When I am in a good mood, I don't want anything to do with death." Along with these entries, Mark had also written a list of names of people he wanted to kill. Despite claiming not to know him, David O'Hearn was in the top 3. Above him was Wollongong's Lord Mayor, Frank Arkell, and above that was Mark's father's name, Jack Van Crevel. At his trial in 2000, Mark attempted to hide behind the gay panic defense, which thankfully is no longer accepted, claiming that his father, Jack Van Crevel, had sexually and physically assaulted him during his childhood, and that this had caused him to lose control when each victim allegedly had sexually propositioned him. Mark's story seemed to have changed again, and was now that he was propositioned by David immediately before the killing occurred, allegedly having pulled down his pants to make his advance. Blood evidence would show that David's pants were on at the time of his death, and that his pants had been pulled down post-mortem. While the story for Frank was that he had seduced him, and that they had been in a sexual relationship for more than a year. During this trial, Justice Tim Stoddart found that Mark's father had been violent towards him, but rejected Mark's evidence that he had been sexually abused by his father, or that either David or Frank had propositioned him, and that this prompted his loss of self-control. A jury found Mark guilty of both murders, rejecting the gay panic defense, and sentenced him to 2 life terms imprisonment. I bet you're thinking, wow, this is a short episode. She's already given the verdict and everything. But we aren't done yet, as this rabbit hole goes deeper still. You see, Mark has a sister, Belinda Van Crevel, who has since been titled as Australia's most evil woman. I don't know if I would call her that myself, but she is definitely an evil woman of Australia. Just 2 weeks after her brother had been sentenced, their father was found stabbed to death. Belinda had escaped her home with her young daughter to flee to the police station 15 minutes away and claimed it was an intruder. The evidence around the home lined up with her story, but unfortunately unraveled as Keith Schreiber would struggle to keep all of his story straight as to where he found the hatchet and the knife that he used to murder Jack. That night, Keith snuck into his room, planning to kill him in his sleep. However, he bumped into a table waking Jack, who acted to defend himself. Keith stood over him after incapacitating him. Jack looked into his eyes and said his name in disbelief as Keith dealt the final blow with his axe. When it was found out that Belinda had in fact manipulated Keith, the police confronted her about her puppetry, where she then became hysterical and claimed that Jack had been molesting her 4-year-old daughter and blamed him for everything that Mark had done. Keith was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment for his role in Jack's death. But what about Belinda? It was a year later when she was brought up on charges of not only enlisting one boyfriend to kill her father, but then enlisting the help of another boyfriend to kill her mother. Why, you may ask? Because her mother had allegedly told the newspapers of her having paid Keith to act on murdering Jack. Boyfriend of the time, Scott Sunderland, claimed that Belinda had driven him to her mother's place, saying that he needed to kill her because if she went down for Jack's murder, it would be through her. Under oath, Scott painted a hideous picture of Belinda, stating how shortly after Jack's murder, she had allegedly aborted Keith's child and said that she didn't want to have a child with the man that killed her father. He also came forward regarding the threat that she had made against him, having to threaten to kill him, his brother, and his grandmother if he ever went to the police, further stating that he would not be safe in or out of prison. Belinda was sentenced to 6 years in prison and was released in 2006. You would assume a stint like that in prison would be enough to set anyone straight. But if the cases I have ever covered have proven anything, it is that that would not be how it goes. 8 years later, Belinda was back before a judge and pleading guilty to stabbing her partner 5 times in an attack in July of 2013. Where she was then only sentenced to 3 years in prison. Many people have interviewed her since, and most have stated how it is disturbing that she shows no remorse at all for her crimes. And when she is asked if people should feel safe around her, she'll seem shocked at the question. Belinda was quoted as saying, "Why not? Of course people can feel safe. If people don't do the wrong thing, bad things won't happen to them." Which I have to say is quite the disturbing response. It really does remind me of that bratty child that I'm sure we all knew as kids, where their parent couldn't see them doing anything wrong. They could steal things from you, physically abuse you, and yet the only time discipline would be dished out for anything would be if you retaliated, because then the little brat princess would go crying to their mother as if you were someone horrible. But I digress. All of this really does leave questions about both Mark and Belinda. Like, was the alleged abuse at their father's hand true? Is there such deep seated trauma that pushed them to this? Is there mental illness that remains undiagnosed? Or even, are they both just truly evil? And on that note, my lovelies, that is all I have for you this week. As always, I will be posting pictures relevant to the case on Instagram and Facebook at What You Should Know Australia. You can keep up to date with any and all updates by following me on Twitter at Whiskapod. That is WYSKAPOD. If you want to reach out to me or have any suggestions for cases, you can send them to me at whatyoushouldknowaustralia@gmail.com. But until next week, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!